Okay, okay, here we are. Thank you. First thing I want to say is my apologies for this complex title, which is actually probably the most awful title I've ever used in one of my talks. But I hope and somehow I promise you that by the end of this talk, you will have a better ideas of all, how all these notions combine together and what do they mean. So my talk is about a very complex question, probably the most complex question for people who are involved in heritage studies. So this question is, what is the value of cultural heritage and where does this value reside, if anywhere? So where is this value based on? So this is a $1 million question, of course. And the way I thought I could approach it is by focusing on two notions, which are actually the main notion in my title too. So on the one hand, we have the concept of everydayness, which is also somehow the leading notion in our colloquium. And on the other hand, I have the notion of cultural heritage, of course. So I start with cultural heritage. If we want to give somehow a very basic definition of what heritage is, we are used to say that heritage means everything that is special, unique, outstanding for us. So we can imagine ruins of a glorious past. We can imagine sublime landscapes, buildings of immeasurable beauty and artistic appeal, and so on. So cultural heritage corresponds to all the most valuable things that our ancestors have bestowed upon us. So somehow the gifts that we have received from past generations. I think it is not a chance that, in many Latin languages, like Italian, for instance, the word that is used to define heritage is patrimonio, which means actually all the estates or the assets that are transmitted from father to son. So somehow this indicates that heritage is meant like a family treasure, a treasure that can be disputed by different family members, so to say, but whose exceptional significance no one really put into question. If we switch now to the second question, so the notion of everydayness, we have a completely different situation. So at first glance, it may seem that heritage is really probably one of the most remote notions to that of everydayness that we can think of. So everydayness is defined, for instance, by the Oxford English Dictionary as what is commonplace and ordinary, so everyday objects, practices, activities that lack significance or have lost it because of daily use or recurrency. So somehow the idea is that repetition is the generative law of everydayness. It's like, this kind of games that children do when they repeat a word until it loses meaning. So our everyday life is reiterated over and over again. And as a result of this, it's rendered empty and boring and trivial. So this leads me to the second notion, which is another important notion for us today, that of banality. So the idea is that much of our everyday life is banal in the sense that it is based on habitual and humdrum routines that are deprived of any new or interesting qualities by their constant recurrency. So once you have these two notions put one next to each other, you may wonder what cultural heritage have to do with everyday life, given that the former, as we have just seen, identifies everything that is most special, significant, and non-banal in our culture. And the other notion captures only mundane and trivial and miserable things somehow. So isn't the very combination of heritage and everydayness paradoxical in itself? I think that appearances aside, there are in fact reasons why we should keep these notions together. And the aim of my talk today, apart from defining the title, which is, the main objective somehow, but the scope of my talk is to show you how profoundly these two notions actually interact with each other and how they influence the way we experience and perceive cultural heritage. So I think the first thing to somehow ground my approach today may be to outline the procedures that underpin the creation of what we can define as official cultural heritage. When I say official here, I am only referring to those sites that are recognized as UNESCO World Heritage Sites. But there is a distinction between UNESCO and other non-official, like national or regional heritage. And I want to leave discussion on this distinction to the Q&A, maybe because it's a complex issue, but I think it's important to state that although these sites, so these regional or local kind of heritage, are not classified as World Heritage in an official sense, they can actually play an influential role in the way we conceive of our national or local identity. The question is how does a site come to be officially included on the UNESCO World Heritage List? So from a technical point of view, there is a selection process which is managed by a body which represents the sovereign state of the territory in which the site exists. And is then submitted to a committee, which is the UNESCO World Heritage Committee, which is in charge of evaluating all the nominations. So a site to be considered part of our cultural heritage must be of outstanding universal value and must satisfy at least 1 out of 10 criteria, some of which are purely aesthetic. So these criteria include, for example, representing a masterpiece of unique creative genius, bearing a unique or at least exceptional testimony to a cultural tradition, containing superlative natural phenomena or areas of exceptional natural beauty or aesthetic importance, and so on and so forth. So once a particular place is recognized as successful in this sense, it is then inserted on the official heritage register. And afterwards, it starts to be treated differently from other types of places. So it is expected in particular that the place, the new site, is accurately managed and upkept, and there are funds that are allocated from a national and international level for this to occur. Okay, so you have now an outline, just a picture of the standard procedure by which a site receives official recognition and is placed on the UNESCO register. What you can notice here is that this is a top-down process because values and meanings are attributed to a site through an act of institutional acknowledgement. But there is a sense in which heritage sites, as we just mentioned, are more than mere items on a catalogue, so to say. So as I said, for a place to count as cultural heritage in a substantial sense, it must be perceived or experienced as a site of human value. So it must matter to individuals and communities, and possibly to the entire humanity. So in this sense, the notion of heritage only makes sense in relation to some individuals or group of people who perceive it as significant. An important question in this regard is how is this perceived significance of heritage needs to be understood. I think that one interesting way to do this is by using this idea of a sort of web of meanings that wraps around the tangible objects. So we're talking about buildings, places, constructions, and so on. So in this sense, each heritage site is surrounded by a series of immaterial aspects. So somehow the language we use to describe it, the cultural significance it has, the role it plays in mundane routines, and so on. Aspects which are crucial to determine how the site is perceived and experienced. So in particular, much of a site's perceived significance seems to reside on the site being a reference point by which a certain group of people understand itself in relation to the environment it inhabits. So heritage sites, in this sense, function as landmarks for people and contribute to shape the way of knowing and making sense and valuing their everyday experience. So we shall soon return to this notion, but I want to put some special emphasis here on this everyday character of the experience, because it's through these everyday practices that heritage significance is actually generated at the local level. So we can define this process the bottom-up process of heritage creation, whereby the notion of bottom-upness here refers to all these processes through which some environments are invested with significance and valued by people who live them. So this has some echo in the environmental psychology literature. These empirical studies, so studies in environmental psychology, have shown that places have a dramatic influence on how people self-represent themselves and their relation toward a territory. So this is a kind of sentimental bond which is known in the literature as place attachment. So what is place attachment? Place attachment is defined as the affective rapport, link, or the involvement between people and specific locations of their everyday life, something which develops over time and most of the time without a real awareness. What is interesting is that according to many authors, place attachment is an integral part of identity creation processes, both for individuals and for members of cultures and communities. So the way we inhabit an environment, the practices we perform in our everyday life, all these express and shape who we are. Place appears in this sense more as a psychological notion than as a physical dimension. A psychological notion which is permeated by a variety of meanings which are associated with the location by individuals and group of people. Again, the important thing here is that everyday practices play a key role in the place-making process. So a local becomes a befitting part of a person's individuality and starts to serve as a sign or a locus of the self through daily intercourse. So when we imbue a place with a personal meaning of our quotidian life, this place is transformed into a sort of symbolic dimension of our mind. So a landscape becomes a mindscape, and a space becomes a place. So the role of quotidian experience in this process is interestingly highlighted by the notion of place insideness, which comes from a psychologist called Graham Rawls. According to Rawls, this idea to be inside a place means to belong to a place and also to identify with a place. So that the more inside a person is with a place, the stronger is her identity to the place. So this sense of insideness is physical, as it is social, as it is autobiographical. It is the awareness that we live in a known, familiar setting with all these associated routines, within an order of shared community life and social exchange, and within a personal landscape of meaningful memories. So all these three aspects combined together strengthen and reinforce our emotional attachment to a place, which leads to the positive feeling that we wear the setting like a glove, in the sense that we are so familiar with the place that, you know, we can wear it somehow, like we wear a glove. So, of course, there is still no consensus among scholars on all, you know, the details of place attachment and what kind of places people mainly develop attachment to, or what physical, social, temporal variables influence our attachment. However, what is interesting for the purposes of my talk today is that it has been shown that heritage sites represent strong purveyors of attachment feelings. So these sites, more than others, seem to be embroiled in the construction of personal and group sentiment. This is expressed by a quotation by urban theorist Jane Jacobs, who says that heritage in itself may be seen as a process of placemaking. So the transformation of a place into a heritage site is a process whereby collectivity is shaped, social orders are reproduced or challenged in the interaction with an environment. So heritage sites, through their iconic features, which echo memories of the past, they create the basis for a shared narrative, and they facilitate the feeling of belonging and being in a place. These feelings, of course, are not completely dependent on the official values of the site, but are rather generated somehow collectively through the everyday grassroots interaction between people and the site. So, as discussion on placemaking testify, while we consider the perceived heritage value of a site, it's crucial that we ponder the meaning it embodies for a certain community, its everyday uses, as well as how a site is perceived as a resource for the local people to meet their own economic, social, personal, and emotional needs. So this brings me to the core of my topic today. So when we construe a place in this complex sense of environmental psychology, a heritage site can be seen as a sort of catalyst of everydayness for people. So a sort of unifying hub that creates and organizes everyday spatiality for local people, and thus come to be evaluated by people through its functionality and uses more than through its historic or official value. So this social and lived-in dimension of heritage is what I refer to as everyday heritage. So what is this notion about? Everyday heritage does not identify any particular kind of heritage place or items, but more it stands for the complex sum of practices, activities, and meanings by which communities use all types of local heritage to reinforce their connection to particular places and to each other. So this everyday heritage dimension is of course all the stronger when the site is a public space, as it happens, for instance, in many cases of urban heritage complexes. Why? Because what makes these sites especially relevant is the fact that they are always there for people in their everyday routines. So unlike other types of heritage, we do not have to move anywhere to see them. We do not have to go to any museum, to any specific location, because this kind of heritage are always there, shaping our quotidian experience. So for this reason, urban heritage structures, which are embedded into the city fabric, have been adapted to a variety of social, physical, and cultural uses throughout history, and thus have contributed to model the urban social and spatial morphology. Okay, I think that here you really need some examples, because otherwise you may not follow me. So I want to start with an example of what I mean by everyday heritage. And I think that one of the contexts in which this notion is better exemplified is the case of historical villas and urban parks or gardens. So I want you to consider here one example, which is the Pincian Garden, Giardini del Pincio in Rome, where I live, which are located in the city center, so near Piazza del Popolo, Villa Medici, really the city center. So these gardens were laid out at the beginning of the 19th century by a famous architect called Giuseppe Valadier. And they have an official heritage value because they are surrounded by numerous monumental furnishings, including fountains, as you can see here. There is a lake with a small temple, And then there is a very famous Belvedere from which you have a panorama of the whole city, so it's very nice. However, the site's everyday heritage significance lies in all the set of practices that surround the use of this garden by a wide range variety of people, including many children, who gather there to meet, stroll, perform all their daily activities. What is important to notice from my point of view is that these two aspects of the site are not in contrast with each other, but rather interact and contribute together to shape the user's experience, reinforcing the sense of place, identity, and belonging. So, for example, the official heritage elements in the Pincian Gardens, so the statues, the architectures, the fountains, and so on, they guide and they direct people's everyday movements in the park, and they facilitate navigation of the space, while also providing, of course, a sense of time and a distinctive character to the site as a historic place. Another example that may be useful for you to understand what I mean by everyday heritage is that of these old fortifications, which surround many cities throughout Europe. So what is interesting is that these city walls in the 18th and maybe early 19th centuries, they were regarded as annoying legacies of the past, which hindered, the development of modern cities, and they prevented traffic roads from being widened and so on. At a certain point, they were recognized as and conserved as urban heritage. And from that moment on, city walls started to play a sort of a very important role, let's say, in the life of the cities, not just as touristic attractions, but also as part of the everyday commute for the local people. So today, historic walls are often open to the public. You can see, for instance, here I chose the example of York city walls. On the other hand, you have the Bratislava city walls, where you can walk on freely. And they are open to the public as somehow elevated walkways, so to say, and they allow people to experience the city landscape from a different perspective, so from the above, and create connectivity among different urban districts. They are uninterrupted pedestrian routes for walkers, which produce a sense of continuity and special order through the act of moving through a linear space. Moreover, in many cases, green public spaces are often enclosed between the intramural and extramural areas, offering people an everyday destination for their leisure stays. This is, for example, the case of the Dubrovnik city walls in Croatia, where the garden was designed in the 19th century, and it's now a pleasant outdoor for local people and for visitors like me, which I visited this place some years ago. So you see a picture. Okay, so these and other similar everyday uses of heritage highlight this vital interplay that obtains between a place, heritage, and the people, and somehow show the ways through which historical sites shape and reshape urban everyday life. From a more conceptual point of view, an interesting aspect in this regard is that there seems to be a close relationship between the emergence of heritage, everyday significance, and the site's perceived aesthetic features. So aesthetic considerations seem to play a central role in the process of heritage placemaking. They reinforce the attachment and strengthen the feeling of belonging for the local residents. Of course, when I say aesthetic consideration or aesthetic value here, I am not simply talking about the supposed outstanding aesthetic value, either artistic or natural, required for a site to be included on the UNESCO Heritage Register. I am interested instead in this enlarged construal of aesthetic quality of value that has been developed in recent work in the field of everyday aesthetics and environmental aesthetics too, of course. And that considers quotidian intercourse and relationship and interaction central for the ascription of aesthetic values to objects and places. So I think that it's not just me, of course. I mean, one major achievement of contemporary investigations in these two fields, so everyday aesthetics and environmental aesthetics, is to highlight that our personal relationship with and our stake in a certain object, rather than being irrelevant or pernicious, are in fact crucial for the ascription of aesthetic character to it. So there is an extent to which the aesthetic dimension of objects only emerges when we are involved, engage, and interact with them in our daily experience. So rather than a sort of disinterested judgment, the attribution of aesthetic value can be seen as an experience of pleasure and meaning that results when a special bond is established between a subject and an object. This idea lies at the basis of what has been called the engaged aesthetic approach that everyday aestheticians defend. Many compelling arguments have been offered by contemporary aestheticians to support the claim that our aesthetic appreciation cannot be dissociated from our personal as well as our cultural and societal interest we have for objects. In particular, regarding the natural and built environment too, their analysis demonstrated that our appreciation of natural aesthetic character cannot be detached from the personal rapport we have with it. Perception of aesthetic value in the environmental context has been proven linked to how we feel in a given place and to the meaning we give to it, which indicate the existence of a significant affective component in our appraisal of places. So in this sense, whether a subject is native to a particular locale, having lived or worked there for his or her entire life, or just a tourist passing by, deeply affect the way she or he perceives the aesthetic character of the place and what kind of aesthetic experience he or she can undergo. Because of space constraint, because I know that you all know maybe better than me all these arguments, and I don't want to be banal, I'm not going to focus on any details of this, but I want nonetheless to spend some words to illustrate and discuss with you a proposal that seems to me particularly relevant for the argument I am trying to defend. So I am notably referring here to Finnish philosopher Arto Haapala accounts of place appreciation in the everyday context. So according to Haapala, as you may know, in everyday life, we have two basic modalities through which we experience and relate to a place, which he calls strangeness and familiarity. So while strangeness is the experience we undergo when we find ourselves in a new environment that we don't know, for instance, when we visit a foreign city for the first time and we feel lost in this maze of unknown buildings and streets and so on. Familiarity, on the contrary, is a quality that is possessed by our everyday living environment. So our home, our district, places we know by heart, with all their distinctive features and identifiable aspects. So according to Haapala, once we have settled down into a locale, not only do we recognize the buildings and the spaces, but we also establish an intimate bond with them, which bring us a feeling of comforting stability in its words. So familiar elements in the landscape and known architectural spaces have the role of stabilizing factors for us, and they allow the unfolding of our daily routines. This role, and this is the interesting part, according to Haapala, has a significant aesthetic component to it. Not in the sense that these familiar places are able to surprise us anymore, or they take us somewhere else from the everyday, but exactly because these familiar places are able to secure that our everyday life rhythm flows smoothly and unproblematically. Of course, you know probably already that the reference here in Haapala's conception is to Heidegger's examination of equipment pieces and everyday tools in his Being and Time. So as Heidegger explains, while these items are always present in our everyday existence and make this existence possible, So the computer I'm using here, the chair on which I sit, the room in which I lay, and so on, we hardly pay attention to them. So we can say that they are phenomenologically transparent, so to say. So what is interesting, however, is that these objects, in Happela's account, have not only a practical importance for our way of inhabiting the world, but are also endowed with a special kind of what he calls a silent beauty, which is a very nice expression to say this. So this beauty is capable in itself to engender a distinct form of aesthetic pleasure, which relies on these objects being always, in Heidegger's expression, ready to our hand. So they always there for us and continuously fulfilling the function they were created for. So Heidegger's standard examples here is that of the carpenter. So Heidegger said the carpenter, while he is engaged in trouble-free hammering, may take some aesthetic pleasure in the hammer he is using, in the nails, in the workbench, exactly because all these items allow he or her to be a carpenter and therefore act out his or her peculiar way of being in the world. So to the same extent, if we go back to the environmental case, familiar places, according to Happela, give us aesthetic delight inasmuch as they are there for us. They accompany our mundane routines, and they enable us to be fully ourselves. Of course, this delight is as much aesthetic as it is existential, because it depends on a certain state of wellness that is linked to the realization of our existential structure. Okay, so Happela's reflection on the interaction between aesthetic and existential aspects in the process of place appreciation, it's important for me because it gives further ground to the heritage picture I am trying to canvas here. Particularly when it comes to culturally significant places and settings like heritage sites, the importance of this interplay between affective, aesthetic, existential aspects should not be ignored, I think. All these factors contribute to a similar extent to make a site appreciated and valued at the local level. So whereas the specific architectural and artistic features of a place are key for the attribution of UNESCO status to it, the happenings of the everyday life are key for the formation of those feelings that are responsible for and constitutive of the place's everyday significance. This is not to say that these two kinds of values can be thought of as independent from each other, and even less am I trying to argue that they are mutually incompatible. On the contrary, I think that if heritage has a relevance for humanity, it is precisely because of its ability to combine together these two different dimensions. So on the one hand, heritage sites are actually culturally and aesthetically incredible examples, so special in the most high sense of the word. They represent the best and the most special achievements of human culture. And thus, in this sense, they stand out from the flow of the everyday. But on the other hand, as we have seen, as I try to show you, these sites also shape our daily life, provide spatial stability, social order, and create a sense of temporal continuity for individuals and community, and also give people aesthetic pleasure through comfort and familiarity. So the value of heritage, in this sense, lies both in its everydayness, so in its power to form and give substance to the routines of our days, and in the force it has, on the other hand, to draw us away from the daily humdrum. And although one may be tempted to regard the latter type of values as more important than the former, I hope to have at least, I try to show you that there is in fact a role for both of these aspects, and there are no compelling reasons why to dismiss either of them. In conclusion, I want to go back for a moment to the main topic of this colloquium for some sparse and maybe more personal thoughts. So as I pointed out at the beginning of my paper, everything can, and in fact does, become banal by way of repetition. Even the greatest buildings, the most spectacular architectures, lose their attractiveness when we see them every single day. So for me, driving past the Colosseum almost each morning, well, actually, this is not true anymore because I work from home, so I'm not seeing the Colosseum every single day, but let's say almost. What is the Colosseum? It's just a big mundane thing, a sort of obstacle that I have to turn around everywhere, every time to go where I have to go. But this doesn't mean that the Colosseum is less important to me or that I care less about it. On the contrary, the Colosseum has become, so to say, part of the furniture of my inner self. And its presence every day, it's one of the few certainties that I have in my life. To a similar extent, we can argue that even the beautiful Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman of all time, might have eventually appeared ordinary and banal to Paris once he had to wake up next to her every single morning in the well-walled city of Troy, as is attested by this picture. And yet, as history teaches us, I think that these everyday, familiar, and even banal things have been often the reason why people have been most ready to fight, and wars have been waged, and empires have been made and unmade. So, thank you. I don't see you, so I don't know if I'm talking to somebody, but yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much for a very interesting paper and presentation. I see that you stopped sharing. That's really good because we will try to share the comments. The commentator for your paper, Adrian, you already know. So Adrian needs to make the sharing because there is some difficulties with this computer, but we already had another computer, and you can see Jana and Adrian in one window. Some seconds, and I will start.
Okay. Is it visible to you?
No.
No.
It's not.
Okay, I'll read it.
Okay. So we will continue without the sharing. Adrian will just read it as I understand correctly. We are sorry for this technical inconvenience.
You are stopping to share it, yeah? I will try to share it from this computer instead.
You have it okay, yes?
Is it visible to someone?
Yeah, it's starting to be visible. Okay.
Is it visible to someone?
Very good.
Yeah. So, despite the fact I will trying to speak clearly, I share the screen with you to be really understandable about what I will trying to talk. First of all, I would like to thank Lisa Giombini for her insightful paper, and I mean it really. Her interest in cultural heritage is well known to those who know her, and I personally had a chance to hear her thoughts on the issue during the last coordinated conference here at our faculty. It seems to me quite a difficult undertaking to find a new way to approach the notion of heritage given that the heritage field is of interest to a striking number of scholars from several different scientific perspectives, and so much has already been written on the topic. So, does Lisa's account succeed in enlarging the scope of this discussion? As I will argue in my commentary, I think Lisa's attempt is successful, at least in bringing some fresh air to contemporary discussions. What Lisa does in this paper, combining different sources to defend what she calls a bottom-up heritage approach, seems actually a sensible thing to be done. In particular, I think that referring to everyday aesthetic inquiries adds a new layer to our description of cultural heritage and leads us to better understand what lies at the core of that intangible web of meanings, which I think surround all objects, not just heritage sites. Furthermore, I concur with Lisa's intention of proving that even from notion of banality and everydayness, that we generally construe as radically detached from our heritage concept, we can nevertheless draw some well-grounded position on the topic. As Lisa states at the end of her paper or talk, heritage sites work in two ways. On the one hand, these sites stand out from the flow of our everydayness, and this is why they are inscribed on local, national, or UNESCO registers as exceptional outcomes of human culture. But heritage sites also ground our feeling of being home, reinforce our cultural attachment, and stimulate the arousal of feelings that are, as Lisa claims, quotation follows, responsible for and constitutive of the place, everyday significance, end of quotation. While heritage's former aspects have been extensively discussed in the literature, also with an eye to the obvious aesthetical potential, the major contribution of Lisa's paper is, I think, to put emphasis on the latter kind of everyday aspects that are responsible to ground the bottom-up approach. In order to do this, Lisa offers several arguments and examples that attest our daily care for cultural sites. In this regard, she argues that heritage sites are reference points for individuals or social groups who perceive them as significant, and that once such attributions are made, these sites engender a process of place attachment or placemaking, which is threatened by different kinds of everyday practices and public gardens, walking on city walls, etc. Heritage sites, she claims, make us accustomed to a local and fit to place and vice versa, and contribute to our hominess feeling broadly conceived. And although scholars still do not agree on how to conceive of this process, we know for sure that heritage sites represent strong purveyors of attachment feelings. Although I'm sympathetic to the general picture, I have some doubts about the strength of these feelings when it comes to particular situations. Like, for instance, in the case of colloquium example mentioned at the end of the paper. In these cases, this type of feelings are weakened by the site's quotidian presence in our life. So perhaps the emotional significance of attachment should be reconsidered. For instance, emotional involvement may be strong in the case of tourists who discover a place for the first time and take special intellectual or sensual pleasure in its beauty. But local people's emotional reaction may be attenuated by repeated frequentation with the site. Without entering the details of this discussion, what is more interesting is that while drawing evidence of these processes from the environmental psychology literature and from everyday heritage findings, Lisa also combines them in a fruitful way, I think, with theories from the everyday aesthetics field. Importantly, all these theories originate somehow from Berlian's aesthetic of engagement, an account in which Kant's notion of disinterestedness is challenged and replaced by the notion of subject's involvement when experiencing everyday life objects, and I shall return to this issue soon. Emil Brady's idea of significant affective component is in ecstatic experience as art, and Arto Hapala's notion of comforting stability both contribute in Lisa's reconstruction to give ground to an alternative understanding of cultural heritage, opposed to the official top-down one. In this sense, as Lisa writes, heritage sites like commonplace objects give us aesthetic pleasure inasmuch as they are there for us, accompany our mundane routines, and enable us to be ourselves. While I strongly agree with this idea and see especially Hapala's position as really compelling to the argument Lisa is trying to defend, what seems misguided to me is this reference to Berlin's unfair critique of Kant's notion of disinterestedness, a critique that has been taken for granted by most everyday aestheticians and that Lisa too adopted as an argumentative claim in this paper or talk. As I've tried to show in my own work, Kant's theory in the third critique may prove, in fact, to be quite able to embrace everyday aesthetics within its scope once we abandon the usual reading of this concept of disinterestedness. This is not the right place to illustrate in detail how consistent and even beneficial Kant's aesthetic theory may be for investigation into everyday aesthetics, but to support my claim, let me quote how Thomas Leddy, the well-known everyday aesthetician, answers to the question he himself asks. How can disinterestedness play a role in the appreciation of nature or everyday aesthetics phenomena in one of his recent papers? He writes, metaphorical seeing or seeing church by imagination plays a role both in interested and in disinterested attention, and that the main role that disinterestedness plays is simply as a method for highlighting certain sensuous and formal features and freeing up the imagination from the dominance of historical features, allowing for actualizations of the aesthetic object in new ways. As Leddy seems to imply here, a reconception of Kant's aesthetic notions may represent a crucial breakthrough for discussion in everyday aesthetics. In conclusion, and going back to Lisa's talk and paper, I have a few broad questions that I want to raise and that we can address in the discussion. In the first place, I'd like to ask you, Lisa, whether you think that the bottom-up approach may be interpreted as a way to give further relevance to local and national heritage lists, which are often underestimated compared to the UNESCO one. In other words, is this bottom-up approach, which is plausible to me, although somehow opposite to what we call the tourist way of experiencing heritage, is this approach only a theoretical account, or do you think it can also have some more direct consequences for the way we preserve, conserve, or otherwise manage our cultural heritage? Furthermore, what do you think the relation between everyday heritage and cultural heritage are? What I understood from your paper is that you assume that the liaison between these two understandings of heritage should be thought of as present in each instance of site. Is this reading correct, or are there examples of sites in which these two values do not meet with each other and actually remain unrelated? What shall we think of heritage items that do not allow everyday uses? Archaeological sites or sites that are otherwise protected, closed, or inaccessible to the public. Of course, they can still work as landmarks, but shouldn't we also acknowledge the fact that the little close to a site, like what happens in your example of the Colosseum, is different than the walk inside its walls, like in the other examples you provided in your talk and paper. Thank you so much.
Okay. Shall I respond? Yeah, okay. Okay, okay. Thank you for this insightful comments, actually. And I am less confident than you that this account is actually interesting or may provide anything new to the discussion on cultural heritage. However, I hope that at least these ideas of combining this environmental psychology literature with everyday aesthetics and heritage studies is quite original, because there are not so many studies who try to, to recollect all these pieces. So that was my idea in the first place. So as for your questions, I don't see you, Adrian, actually. I'd like to talk to someone. Okay. First, about Kant, I trust you because I am in no way entitled to discuss, the role of disinterestedness in Kant's test in any proper way. So I trust you, and probably you're right. I mean, I think it's what I did is just describing the way this notion of disinterestedness is actually used in the literature, but I'm not sure that this is the correct way. It's just let's say a descriptive kind of mentioning of this notion in my paper, not normative one. So probably you're right. The other question was concerning the practical implications of heritage, if I'm remembering correctly. And yeah, in this sense, I completely agree. I think that, of course, this is not an account, just a theoretical account. The idea is that probably including this bottom-up processes is really relevant when it comes to manage heritage from a practical point of view. So when it comes to deciding what to do with heritage, for instance, when it is disrupted or distracted altogether because of, catastrophic events of many kinds, like natural events, climate change, or wars and vandalism and so on. So the idea of considering all these relationships that obtain between heritage and people is probably important, because it gives us a direction that we can follow when it comes to deciding what to do in our practical interventions. So, of course, it gives us a general principle. It doesn't say, what we have to do, because every situation is different, of course. When it comes to reconstruction or restoration, you don't have general laws. You just have, you need to have a case-by-case evaluation. But however, the idea of considering, this basic grassroots processes that, that link people to places is probably important to reconsider our conservation activity. And I'm interested in this, so yeah. As for the other question, which is actually an important one, the relation between everyday heritage and cultural heritage. So what is this everyday heritage? It's not, it doesn't identify a set of objects. So my idea is that everyday heritage is a way of looking at heritage. So somehow we can have, it's more like a set of values, okay, that almost every object or heritage object has, but in a different, so to say, in a different amount. So it's like a spectrum. On the one hand, you have, let's say, public spaces like the gardens or the city walls that were my examples. In that cases, the everyday heritage dimension is very strong and perceptible. And on the other hand of the spectrum, you have places that, as you mentioned, are completely inaccessible, close to the public, places that we don't interact with because it's prohibited, because they are conserved, because they are preserved, they're for many reasons not as accessible. But also in that case, this doesn't mean that this everyday value of these places is not present. It's there because these places enters in the way people conceive of their relationship to a territory, and they enter the imaginary, and they anyway, they form the way we define our identity, even if we cannot have the same kinds of direct relationship that we can have with other kind of places. So you have, on the one hand of the spectrum, the everyday heritage significance is very strong. On the other hand, it's less strong, but still is there. And it defines, a set of values that I think it's important to understand why is heritage significant for us and why it is conserved and why it has been significant throughout history. So the assumption is that if heritage wasn't significant for people in the first place, it wouldn't be conserved. And the reason why we conserve heritage is because it's significant, not just because of this top-down value, this formal official values, but also because, these values interact with the bottom-up values that are, created by quotidian relationship between people and a place. I don't know if I answered your questions.
Yeah, thank you so much. This explanation, it makes me clear of these whole things. And I see Ankita comment,
Yes.
a question in the chat. So can you please
I read it? Or, yeah.
Just for you to read or yeah, just to be informed by you and try to react to this, please.
I read it, okay. So from Ankuta, okay. So she said, thank you, it's a fascinating topic. Yes, I think it is. I mean, I'm not the only one who think it's fascinating. I guess my worry is that you might have a clash of temporalities in the concept of everyday heritage. Am I experiencing heritage in my own time, in my daily experience, or am I appreciating it for its past value, for transporting me into an out-of-placeness, for getting access to cultures long past? Another worry would be that it might be overplaying the extraordinary character of everydayness, its strangeness, and dismissing an appreciation of the ordinary as ordinary. Okay, so I think that the point is exactly that you have both things together. So heritage is important because it brings you out of your present times and brings you back to a past time. So for its past value, but that past value interacts with present values. So that's the significance. It's an interplay. It's not that just, of course, heritage is linked with the past, but it's not the past. It's how the past is interpreted and it's used and it's perceived and experienced in the present. So that's the complex issue here. You have past as it is used in the present. So this is a way to define heritage. I don't think, and all my point in the paper was to show that these two facets cannot be thought of as separated from each other, but that they have to somehow be conceived of as interacting. Okay, I don't know if it makes sense. And the other words that might be overplaying the extraordinary character of everydayness. I don't know. Since it's a sort of interplay, as I said, I don't think that, in the examples of the Colosseum, in that sense, I don't think that I am putting emphasis on the extraordinary character of me driving past the Colosseum, because it's a boring experience. And, there's traffic and all the stuff, and then you're stuck there, you have to turn around this big thing. So, for instance, in that case, my experience with heritage, the Colosseum in the example, is not really making this experience extraordinary, because it's not extraordinary. But that's the point. The point is that it's familiar, it's ordinary, and still it's significant, just because it's ordinary and significant. Of course, there is a problem with experiencing ordinary as ordinary. I know, I mean, it's a very complicated issue, and what it means to appreciate something as ordinary and not making it strange and so on. But here, I'm really, at least in my example, the point is that, the banal experience of seeing the Colosseum when you go to work this is also part of why the place is important to me, because it's part of my, routine. It's banal, yes, of course it is, but still, for that very reason, it's.
Yeah, this is part of hominess. I was telling you about like extended feeling of hominess, like being home, because this is the world we are belonging to. That is the way I understand this. Would you like to interact?
Okay, I have other questions here. But I don't know if Ankuta is satisfied. Probably she's not, but maybe we should discuss this further on. Can I go on with the other questions? Okay.
Yeah.
So Yana says, I think this question is really interesting. Yeah, me too, because we cannot ignore the concept of history and time represented or preserved by ruins or cultural heritage buildings, but we also cannot ignore our own and contemporary position. But this is from Lucas. Okay, sorry. Okay, sorry, Lucas. Yeah, that's the point. I think that's the idea. I mean, heritage is not history. Heritage is history made present through practice, through use, through function. So the way the past can play in the present, that's the point of all the issue here. And it's interesting, of course. Then I have a comment from Sanna. Thanks for the excellent talk. Thanks, Sanna. It made me think about my own everyday environment in a different light through the notion of everyday heritage. Yeah, I think it's completely different. I mean, my experience, of course, when I start thinking about this issue, I have it in mind my own experience, and I live in Rome, so somehow my experience of heritage is of a standard heritage, like ruins, like the past, really, in its massive presence everywhere. So it's strange to think these in a different environment, like for instance, a Finnish environment should be completely different from the experience I have of this everyday heritage.
There's a question from Michaela. Could you please make a reflection on it?
Michael, yeah. Did pandemic restrictions in Rome and the emptiness of the city change the way of looking at the Colosseum, for example? Did your everydayness become extraordinary again? Yeah, but partly so. I mean, I mentioned this, I was used to drive past the Colosseum every single day. Now it's not really the case because I'm working from home. So most of the time I see these four walls and don't see anything else. So this changed the experience. We were brought back to strangeness, to use Hapala terms. When I visited, Fontana di Trevi, you were living there when you were in Rome a few months ago. So Fontana di Trevi, it's a place where it's always full of tourists. You don't really have any, when you go there, normally you see the fountain, you see people, and then on the back something. And I was there was no one, and it was impressive. It was a completely different experience from this everydayness of, so of course the pandemic changed it a lot. We changed the mind, and we also changed our routines. So that's why probably, our looking at things changed.
From our Rosa.
Ciao, Rosa. I don't see you, but okay. Thank you so much. It was okay. Thank you. Our routine is related to our everyday life aesthetic experience, above all to the space environment. Yeah, it's true. I mean, I think this is one key aspect of everyday, the relationship between space and routines, and how routines, involve into a place and not in another one. Oh, ciao, Rosa.
Thank you so much. Ciao. Hi, everyone. Ciao.
Okay, sorry, this is an Italian. Small.
Some few minutes before the coffee break starts, are there some other questions from the public, from the participants who attend this event online? If there are, please ask Lisa actually now. If not, So again, I thank you so much, Lisa, for this insightful paper and to all the interesting examples you choose for this.